Thank you, Ellen. So we've heard three different perspectives, or I should say, three presentations that provided a little bit of a different angle on evidence. Keith was really dealing with primary data collection and specific individual studies, although some of those principles translate into the other two presentations. Alan actually talked about a specific systematic review, and Patrick took it almost one step further, and that was a review of systematic reviews on a different topic. So I'd like to open the discussion, like to open the floor to questions and discussion. And maybe what we'll do is begin by asking those of you who have questions to pose them, and we'll probably take 4 or 5 of them, to individual speakers, just for if you wanted additional clarity or questions on points that they raised. And then I think we'll try to generate a discussion and maybe reflect on the extent to which some of the presentations we heard in the past 2 days, or some of the research that you're doing yourself, are using some of these principles, or if you wanted suggestions or raise questions you yourself have as you're planning studies going forward, this would be an opportunity to bring those up. So why don't we take a couple of questions to start with? And your affiliation.
So I'm Deirdre Zimmerman, and I'm from NPCS, a nutrition NGO here in Kathmandu. And my question is there a problem with the journals and the general academic profession that we rely on for information, not demanding sufficient standards from research before they publish them? Because all these big journals produce a whole journal of new research every month, and it seems like you're pointing out the fact that a lot of these studies, the design and therefore the conclusions, are not that reliable. And is there any push from that side to demand better research and outcomes and conclusions?
Deirdre, if I understood your question, it's related to whether journals screen the quality of the data that gets published adequately, yes.
They're doing
and
it
what
enough.
That process is like, perhaps.
Yeah, and is there any drive? I mean, every month they have to produce their journal.
There we go. Hi, I'm Jerry Shively from Purdue University, and in my spare time, I actually edit a journal. And for the last 9 years, I've been the editor of a journal, not in the health arena or the public health arena, but rather in the economics arena. And I think that you bring up a really important point. Many journals are moving pretty quickly and rapidly to a system in which a requirement for publication is to publish the data that go along with the study, and often the protocol, and in some cases even the programs that were used to conduct the analysis. And that's something that we have initiated at our journal on a sort of voluntary basis. And we think that over time, it's certainly raising the standards of publication. But I think you point out an important point, that academics haven't done enough to police themselves. Now, we rely on, of course, peer review, and the quality of peer review is somewhat variable. But I think that another side of this is that many people view academic research in a way as generating a marketplace of ideas, a marketplace of work. And some things get published, and they turn out to be important and citable and key findings, and other things are published and maybe fade from view. And so in the marketplace of ideas, not everything has lasting impact, I guess. But I think there are two issues there. One is, are journals doing enough to police themselves, and is the peer review process working? And I think that there's variability, but on the whole, there's a lot of integrity in how reviewers approach their task. And then at the journals themselves, I think over time, many of us have tried to raise the bar by requiring not just the publication of the study and the results, but also the data, and in some cases even the programs that were used to generate the results that are published in the paper so that they can be replicated by anyone.
Namaste. My question goes to Alan Dangoor and Patrick Webb, and maybe all people can join and if relevant can answer. Actually, my question is about relevance of the evidence we have generated. So that my proposition or my question or my query or my comment is whether there is a possibility for the scientists not to go for seeing what is produced, but to have a systematic way of doing things, what is needed. So that because whenever you do research, contextually it is that whatever you have in pocket, you do it. Whoever provides and somebody either who is funding it. But my proposition and my comment is about the relevance of the data. What's your comment? Thank you.
The relevance of it was the relevance of the data you're talking about. Well, I think that relates to what Keith was saying in terms of generation of data that answers a very well specified question. And so simply doing studies for the sake of doing studies adds lots of evidence, and some of that evidence could be of high rigor but low relevance. I think that's partly what you're trying to get at. So ideally, for example, through these systematic reviews and through the journal editors who sift through thousands of draft publications every year, certain ideas and certain gaps in the evidence emerge as being priorities. And I think that's really where we need to be more focused in terms of prioritizing scarce resources for research, is to identify the relevant research and then making it of the highest quality possible. That's how I would answer that. Just on the journal review process, in addition to what Jerry said, I absolutely think the peer review system is if not broken, it's creaking at the edges. And Jerry this morning referred to it as waves breaking on the shore. They just don't stop. The waves of new papers, of new findings, it just doesn't stop. And the process whereby peers review very rigorously that information is getting very stretched because the volume of draft publications grows way faster than the availability, the time available, and the individuals who are competent to review those. And I can give you examples of several cases of articles that I've personally rejected as a peer reviewer. I've said that simply this is low quality, it doesn't answer the question, it's no, reject. And 2 months later I see it published in another journal. And this is happening all the time. And so, yes, we do need more discussion on that. And could I ask maybe Dr. Baral to mention, Dr. Baral just yesterday was saying that even in Nepal, there are too many journals. And maybe you want to say something about that. There are too many journals generating too many papers, but there isn't enough focus on concentration and quality. But you want to say something about that, Dr. Baral?
Probably Dr. Wagley was also referring to priority setting of the research as well, the agenda of priority for the local priority. I think that's very important. Sometimes it's related with the availability of resource globally, because someone who is looking from the local perspective and global perspective, sometimes, we need to match the interest or the priority area. Otherwise, we might. The practical thing is we might not get the funding as well, because someone who is funding, probably they will see things from globally. The other important this article about Nepal is actually there are university are setting for their promotion to publish article, and what is happening, which is bad. What is happening is each of these medical college or the university started, publishing their own journal. Whether they meet the requirement internationally standard or not, if they publish article on their own journal of the university, that's accounted. For other journal, that's, many of the article is rejected. The reason here, again, the reason for the publication is different. Not to generate knowledge and to establish facts and, to raise the standard of science. The objective is very, very different. That's what I see. And the quality of paper, even, the paper of faculties is lower than the graduate student thesis. That's we can see when the language, the presentation, the whole objective is very, very different. And it's really becoming a problem for this country. We have actually 7, 8 journals currently we have in this small setting. Each of the medical colleges, but just to meet the requirement of the university. And the university set the principle, if they publish journal by themselves, whether that's peer review or not, whether that's accounted or not, they consider as a accepted publication standard. It's been, we need to work on this as a especially to the student. We need to raise our standard, otherwise we won't be able to go beyond generating knowledge in the science.
If I can just make an additional comment, that is also true internationally. There are hundreds of new journals that have come online in the past year across the health sciences. I get emails of journals that are new. They have fancy titles. They have free publication costs, for the first publication and so forth. It is very much an attractive offer for potential authors, but we have to be very critical of this process. It's a threat to the basis of knowledge, of scientific knowledge, for even just within the health sciences and nutrition sciences alone. And so what is going on in Nepal is actually much worse, I would say, probably even internationally right now.
Keith, I wonder if I can follow up with that, with a question and related to that, and that is, journals do have what's called impact factors, and I'm wondering if any one of you would want to comment on whether those impact factors at all are correlated with the quality of the individual studies that are present in those high impact high impact factor journals.
Alan? I mean, a lot of these new journals do not have impact factors, so that is one criterion that can be applied.
So the impact factor debate is interesting. There's lots of different views on the impact factor. So your journals get impact factors. So for example, the best journal in the world, biomedical journal, is probably the New England Journal of Medicine. It has an impact factor of 35-40. The best nutrition journal in the world, the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, has an impact factor of 7. An awful lot of nutrition journals have an impact factor of around 2 or 3, and 90% of the world's journals have an impact factor of less than 1. So, but then there's an awful lot of journals which don't have an impact factor at all because they're not part of the impact factor system. And for example, there's an awful lot, so in agriculture, there's an awful lot of journals which don't have impact factors but are really important agriculture journals, and that is because they don't come out, or they don't meet specific criteria on the amount of times they publish a year or whatever, but they're really important journals. So impact factor is a very blunt tool for assessing the quality of a paper, but can be quite helpful. I think we have to agree. It can be a marker, I think, at the very least, of the quality of the editorial process. So, for example, if you submit a randomized controlled trial, not to the AJCN, interestingly enough, but to the Lancet, the Lancet will insist on seeing the protocol of the randomized controlled trial, insist on seeing your analysis plan, your pre-specified analysis plan, insist on seeing where you have registered your trial on an international trial registry, and insist that you report the trial according to the consort guidance, which is a very pre-specified way of reporting randomized controlled trials. If you don't have those four things, you won't get your paper published in the Lancet. And so, at the very least, the very top journals are making and so that's for randomized controlled trials, but there are also very clear guidance now on the reporting of systematic reviews. There are also very clear guidance on the reporting of cross-sectional observational studies. So there are now some very clear guidelines, and that's actually an important factor we haven't discussed yet. There's something called the Equator Network, EQUATOR, the Equator Network, which sets out very clearly how different studies of different designs should be reported. And the very top journals insist that you report your study according to that guideline, those guidelines, and they're all about transparency, openness. Have you reported all the information you need to, the rigor? Have you reported the study design? Have you reported exactly what you've done so that another group can copy your study and see if they come up with the same findings? Have you released your data? All these sorts of things. And the very top journals go to great lengths to insist that you do that. So it is a marker of quality, at least of the editorial process, if you get your paper into some of those top journals. Now, those top journals, however, are top journals because they have very high impact factor, and often they have impact factor because they chase a story. So they might find something which is really going to be newsworthy. They know it's going to be newsworthy, so they'll take that paper, and sometimes those papers aren't of the very best quality. So there's a flip side to everything, and you have to be very careful. But I think, for me, one of the key things I always look for is how, so when I read a paper, I read the methods first, and I go very carefully through the method. What exactly did they do? So that I have an understanding of what they've done and how good is the quality of what they've done before I look at the results and anything. And I think that's something, and if they've reported the methods appropriately, and I judge, in my experience that that I can trust what they've done, then I think that's actually quite a useful.
Thank you, Chairman, for giving me the opportunity. First of all, I will like to congratulate all the presenters this morning. It's very thought-provoking, rigorous, scientific, and more theoretical academic presentations, which are really useful for researchers. And while making all these systematic reviews, Professor Patrick suggested that his reviews suggest that these systematic review suggests no association with morbidity, mortality, something like that, if I got properly. But in Nepal, we have number of micronutrients-related research. Actually, you reviewed the most recent researches in the international arena, but in our country, we have made number of studies at the very outset. It's a landmark study in vitamin A that was carried out in Nepal with the support from USAID, and was published in Lancet also. And we suggest that that justified the vitamin A distribution in Nepal, and we are doing it continuously, which has really reduced the morbidity and mortality, vitamin A related morbidity and mortality in Nepal. Like, actually, particularly among children, like night blindness and other morbidities. And we have studies on iron deficiency, folic acid supplementation, and also, iodized salt supplementation studies, and zinc tablet supplementation for reduction of diarrhea, and so forth. Those studies that we have been done in Nepal probably maybe very, useful to cite or to consider. Thank you. That's all from my side.
Yeah, thank you very much. Nepal has really shown the world and contributed to many of the global policies we see today. The most recent one that I'm aware of too is the chlorhexidine work, which which in fact was born in Nepal, and it's really informing the global evidence base and global policy. Dale, you wanted to ask a question, and then Jerry?
So I appreciate the focus this morning on randomized controlled trials and systematic reviews as sort of the gold standard by which many of us want to do our research, and many of us aspire to that. But the reality is probably that a lot of people in the room may not be in a position to do systematic reviews or perhaps even conduct randomized trials, but will be doing observational studies or longitudinal studies. And I just wonder if the members of the panel might reflect on that and maybe comment on how those of us who are doing different kinds of work might improve the quality of our research and make it more meaningful.
I'll take a first shot at that. I think that's very true, and we need to provide the young investigators in this room and outside this room with methodologic guidelines that can help strengthen the rigor of their science, whether it's published in an international journal or whether it's published in the Journal of the Nepal Medical Association. Perhaps a couple of things to be thinking about is going back to the need to have your protocol specified and to follow it. One thing that I did not bring up, and it was just a slip of mind, was that in reporting your study, you need to account for every intended act that you did in your study to accumulate your sample size, your subjects. That life is full of imperfections, and one of the imperfections in population science is that we rarely achieve our sample size. We often have missing values. We often have people who we sought to measure, to assess, that were non-compliant, that were missing, that were not at home, that comprise an incomplete data set. And this structure of your study always needs to be detailed and reported. So you will have your intended sample size. You will have those who you successfully reached and visited, and the difference has to be reported. Amongst those that you saw, there are going to be those individuals whom you obtained all of the measurements that you sought to do, and there are going to be those for whom there are going to be missing data. Those have to be reported, and they are put into something called a consort diagram, a flow diagram, so that your reader can see where your data, what your intention was, and how well you were able to follow that protocol with respect to completing your sample size, the measurements that you intended to make, all the way through the kinds of outcomes, whether it's a trial or it's an observational study. That helps the investigator know, you know, how well your data are going to be regarded by the scientific community, by the reviewers, by the journals. It also allows you to reflect on the quality of your data in terms of how you approach the analysis and how you draw inferences from your findings, because it will tell you, as an objective scientist whether there are likely to be biases in your data, biases being meaning, that your findings are drifting from the likely truth in the population. And all of this is important, and we all experience it. There is not a single scientist who has published a perfect paper. And so realizing that we have incomplete data, that we have potential for biases in our data despite our best efforts, and that we bring these concerns into a paper and into our reflection on the interpretation of the data, all makes for good science. The final point that I just make is be careful not to chase the p-value. You have to pay attention to the quality, to your procedures, to your methods, to your data analysis plan, and let the cards fall where they will with respect to statistical significance. There is still a lot of attention and too much attention being placed on a statistically significant p-value as if that is what you are after. Well, you're not after that. You're after the truth, as close as you can get to that truth. And if the truth is that there are no differences between your groups, whether it's a trial or a case control study, so be it. You have served science by doing that. So be careful. We all fall into that trap. Be careful not to be overly attentive to p-values.
Just adding to that, Jerry, if it didn't come across, I was trying to also make the point that what we are trying to encourage is rigor and quality in every kind of study, observational, non-experimental. And my last slide was explicitly saying, here are the things to avoid just to do a good study, whatever it is. And a good study can then potentially be included in a systematic review. But program-specific or other kinds of non-experimental designs can all be highly rigorous, can all have high value, real value, and be impactful even if they're not in a high-impact journal. And I think that's something that we have to get across. I just wanted to say, I remember I was only talking about wasting. So none of those studies include all of the incredibly valuable vitamin A and chlorhexidine and other studies that have come out of Nepal.
I wanted to say just two things. First thing is the research question is the hardest thing to do, to define. So really the critical step in being a good researcher is being able to define a tractable and askable research question, and being able to be clear about what is the thing you want to find out. Once you can master that, and I haven't mastered it, it's a tough thing to do. It's very, very difficult to ask a really good research question. That's the critical thing. Once you've done that, then everything else is really quite straightforward. Because once you've got your question, then it leads immediately to the type of study you might do, whether it's a cross-sectional study. I want to know the prevalence of vitamin A deficiency in Nepal. I'm not going to do a randomized control trial. I'm going to do an observational study, a cross-sectional study, a prevalence survey. Once you've asked the question, so the clarity you need is that clarity for asking the research question. And then what am I going to do with all that data? And we have an ethical imperative. If you've collected the data, you should. In order to answer my question, I need these 5 variables or these 10 variables. You never need these 1,000 variables. You never need 1,000 variables to answer a research question. So think very carefully about that. So it's asking a clear question and thinking very carefully, what information do I need to answer that question? And the second point I wanted to make is about systematic reviews. I presented a systematic review where I showed the meta-analysis for the cluster randomized control trials, but as I said, we included all sorts of different study designs. I've also conducted systematic reviews with meta-analysis on econometric modeling studies, on cross-sectional data, from observational studies. You can conduct systematic reviews and meta-analysis on any type of study. So you should, don't be frightened, it's just about randomized controlled trials. It's not. You can do this, and it's an important thing to do. So for example, we're just having published a systematic review on the association between vitamin B12 status and neurological function in older people. The association, so that's observational data from cross-sectional studies. That we've looked at the totality of the evidence, we've brought it all together, we've conducted meta-analysis, a systematic review with meta-analysis on cross-sectional data. It's still a really important thing to do, because one study says there is an association between vitamin B12 status and neurological function, another one study says there isn't. So what does all of the evidence tell us? It's still an important thing to do. It's a really important thing to do. So systematic reviews are really powerful for any type of study design.
Thank you, Alan. For those of you who received a copy of the baseline report, an example of what might be like a participant flow diagram is in that for the Pochon study. To give an example, a little bit of the intent of and tracking those households and those individuals from who data was collected. Dale, you had a question, and then Dr. Gauchon.
My question is on operations research, because it occurred to me we're about to begin implementation of a nutrition program which includes integrated management of acute malnutrition. It also includes the full WASH component. What should we be thinking about operations research in this programming? And then, building on what Alan says, how do we come up with the right questions that we would want to ask? And is it worth then doing an operations research perhaps in one whole district that can help to add to the body of evidence on programming to address these issues of stunting and wasting?
Operations research I think is hugely important, and is very relevant, of course, when we're thinking about programming. So operations research really asks questions about process and about how good is the process, how do we improve that process, how has the program worked, how can we make it better? And I think that's critical type of evidence that we do need. I think there are important questions that you can ask in that regard. So a lot of it's going to be monitoring type questions and process type questions, because you want to identify bottlenecks, you want to identify, a lot of it's going to be sort of much more formative type research as well, which I think is critical. We often neglect formative research. So formative research is really about asking the question, if I have this brilliant idea of this intervention, A, does anyone want it? And B, can I deliver it? Yeah, so I've got this, I want to have a WASH intervention. If I go into a village, does anyone want this WASH intervention, or are they very happy with it? And B, if they do say they want it, how am I going to deliver it at scale, and is it feasible? So I think those are really important questions as well. It's a different type of question, so it's not specifically, it adds to the evidence on programming, it adds to the evidence on operations and how to conduct these sort of studies. And I think there's a new area there where we need much more evidence, in fact, to do it properly. I'm going to hand over.
In addition to that, well-conducted, pre-planned operations research can be of immense value beyond the process of program fidelity. It can add to the body of scientific knowledge. But one thing I would make a plea to everyone in the room is all of us have to become stronger advocates to donor organizations or whoever funds research to value rigor and value the evidence that is generated from operations research. Because far too much operations research is set up and the goalposts are changed, programming shifts without any attention to the control group that was pre-planned. And so yes, there are concerns in an operational setting naturally that compete, let's say, with research agendas. Actually, they often conflict with that research agenda. And I think the only way we're going to make progress is to demonstrate to the paymasters the value of rigorous evidence and convince them that they play a role in generating that evidence by supporting it.
I'd like to add a couple of comments if I can. I've been involved in efficacy research where it's very, very research intensive, where you control the delivery. And the operations kind of work is taking it in real life context, where you really don't control much of the delivery. And so that space, I think, is really incredibly important to contribute to. And I don't think randomized controlled trials or efficacy trials really contribute much to that knowledge at all, because a lot of this is context specific, system specific, capacity specific. And so I really think it's critical. Having said that, I think there are a lot of the principles that were discussed today about defining the question, standardizing the choosing the right indicators, standardizing how those are collected or who collects them, thinking about when you would collect them, thinking about how a program rolls out and when you might see some uptake in the program cycle at household level, at a health worker level, at a community level. So I think the principles are still there, and I think I would also say that a protocol for operations research should be written. And I've seen, including an organization that I'm associated with, people do monitoring, or they call it M&E. And you ask them for a protocol. Well, they have a tool. Someone goes out and does supervision. That's our M&E. And I'm really quite shocked, because, in fact, much of that data, which if it was collected systematically and in a standardized way and using indicators that are well-defined, and if there are valid indicators using those, can really contribute to the program space and in a real evidence and a rigorous way. And I think that's an area that many NGOs really need to improve on.
Thank you very much for giving me time to just raise some of the issues about today's presentations. Well, there was very good, presented about selection bias in data collection, analysis, reporting. I think these are very useful insight we have received from speakers. So I just would like to raise one issues which we have faced in developing countries. Well, biases in getting into the publications. Well, how to minimize those biases? Well, biases in data collections is our control. I think it's okay. Biases in getting into publications, like some of the important journals, require. We need to submit name of reviewers, potential reviewers. The authors has to suggest and provide the names. Many times, like people from developing countries like us who have difficulties of having those reviewers getting into their names and potential reviewers and getting into publication. And many times if you submit even the name of reviewers, they decline or they delay and publication gets delayed. And so
my question is kind of similar to Dr. Shively's in that you've talked about how to have rigor when you're kind of designing your own study, but then there is all of this secondary data available, as Dr. Dangor also mentioned. So it's particularly for students who may not have the resources to design their own study. How do you, or first of all, what is the value of that secondary data analysis? And then if you're doing that, how do you ensure that you have kind of optimum rigor within your own study, recognizing the limitations of that data?
In a way, you answered your own question, because recognizing that analysis is secondary implies that the primary questions have been answered. There is still an enormous amount that can be learned from data sets that can be approached. Different questions can be approached through those analyses, as long as one recognizes that these are additional questions and they become exploratory. They become ventures to discover association, to confirm association, or to explore new questions that can be posed in the future to build an evidence base around a new activity, a new question. That happens all the time, as long as it's recognized that this is an enrichment from the original study design and the purpose of the data for which the data were collected.
Take that question one step further. As we know, there are large data sets available in many countries, including Nepal, whether it's the DHS or the Nepal Living Standards Survey. I know of many household health expenditure surveys that are done, and when I speak to people who are familiar with them, they claim that certain aspects have much variability in their quality. So I think what you were also asking was, if I have access to a data set that I haven't collected and I don't necessarily have the quality measures, these are publicly available data, they may or may not have the quality measures, how sure am I mean, I can analyze them and I can assume that they have quality data, but were you also asking a little bit about how to begin to determine whether those secondary data sets are worth analyzing?
I think it's secondary data analysis is very attractive because it's free. You can sit at your desk, you can do it when you're watching the football, or you can do it without getting your feet dirty, your shoes dirty. But that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be conducted with the same academic rigor. So you have a data set which is available. You still need to define a rigorous research question. So you need to spend your time thinking, what is the research question I want to ask of this data set? You need to then spend your time thinking, what are the variables in this data set I can use to answer that research question? And you need to spend your time thinking, what is the analysis that I need to conduct in order to use those variables to answer the research question? So there's still a huge amount of thinking that needs to happen before you should start doing any analysis. There is an enormous risk, especially when you're young, and I spent 1 year of my life with a data set without an analysis plan, playing around, doing this against that, plotting this graph, plotting that graph, complete waste of a year of my life because I didn't have an analysis plan. So I know this only too well, and I'm sure I'm ringing some bells. It is, I can't stress enough the value of when you've got your data set, whether you've collected it or whether you've just taken it off the internet or someone's given it to you, so of spending the time to think carefully about what is the research question, what variables do I need, and how am I going to do that analysis before you do anything else, before you start playing and cross tabs and pictures and all this. Don't waste your time. Think about your research question, your variables, and your analysis plan. I think there is the underlying question, which Rolf brought up as well, which is about what are the quality of the data. And I think that is obviously something you need to think about before you do any analysis. Is it worth, so it's about the data set in general, is it good quality? But it's also about the specific questions on the data set, and I think that's quite an important thing as well. Do I believe that if I ask if the question there has been asked in that way, that the answer is going to be correct? And I think there's a lot of thinking there as well, because sometimes questions are asked in very ambiguous ways, or ways which aren't clear, or ways which might lead the answer, the participant to answer in a particular way, and then it's very difficult to interpret your analysis. So I think there's 2 questions, 2 points there. There's one which is the overall quality of the data that's being collected, and the second point is about the specific questions and whether they're robust enough to answer the questions you're interested in.
Thank you. First, thanks for the very interesting presentations, and thanks to everyone for this lively discussion. My name is Jussi Kanner. I'm a consultant working for the European Union at the moment, which means that my perspective is more of from the donor side and not from the academia or from people doing research, more from maybe the audience or the target group of the research. Now, the unfortunate situation at the moment is that probably many people in my position don't have enough time to read the reports in the detail with the time that they actually deserve. We are too busy keeping the wheels of bureaucracy turning all the time. So, and of course, we get a lot of reports on our desk all the time that we should be reading. Alan said earlier that he starts reading the reports from the methodology part. Now, in my situation, unfortunately, it's probably the first one that I will skip when I start reading the reports. I will mainly look at the summary, the conclusions, and the recommendations, because these are the most useful ones for the people doing programming or policies and stuff. So my question is now that would there be any kind of easy pointers for us what to look in the reports that would make the alarms ring that maybe this study in question has not been conducted in a rigorous way? Are there some very, very typical mistakes in that sense that you see all the time coming up that it could be easy for us to spot and see which reports are good and whatnot? I mean, Alan mentioned a couple in his presentation, but if you have other ones, I would be very grateful. Thank you.
I would have a very good science advisor. I'm serious. That is one way, or a group of experts that you can readily shoot a report to give you feedback. This is one example of domain experts where they can play an important, quick, reactive, and informed role before you go too far down a report in a particular area. There's really no substitute for understanding the quality of studies. Bad studies can get into big reports and distort the overall effect estimates of a global program or a particular set of findings. So we all understand. I also go to abstracts frequently first, even though I should not, only because of lack of time. And so there needs to be a process in place where you can find somebody who can give you a trusted response to some of those issues. They're really important.
I would second that, and I think so as I said the other day, I work for DFID 2 days a week, and my specific job in DFID is to provide scientific advice. So I'm a senior research fellow. I provide scientific advice to DFID on nutrition, agriculture, study design, research quality, those sorts of things. And I've specifically been employed to sit in the Research and Evidence Division to help them understand evidence. And that happens in two main ways. Number one way, someone will send me a paper and say, I've just seen this, what does it mean? And then I have to write back a summary, which then gets distributed amongst DFID's advisors. This is the new study. It tells us this. It doesn't tell us this. We can use it in this way. And the other thing that my job is to identify important studies and to write brief summaries and circulate them amongst the group as well, amongst the DFID advisors. So I don't think that's your job. I don't think because as you say, and if I think of my DFID colleagues, they haven't got the time, but they also haven't got the technical expertise. So I am employed specifically, one of my tasks is to provide that high-level expertise. And I wonder, Rolf, if we could move it on then, because your final point on the board was, when do we have enough evidence for policy action? So this then leads directly onto that point. So sometimes a paper will come across the table, a really, really important paper, a randomized control trial or a systematic review, which is changing the evidence base and might then come into, that might then cause policymakers to sit up, or we might want to draw to the attention of policymakers within DFID or in the international community. I'm thinking a good example is the trial last year that I'm sure many of you know about, that was published in the Lancet on the potential that there was a dangerous impact of sprinkles, so micronutrient supplements for children. So the trial was published in the Lancet, 2,500, 3,000 children, I can't remember, and if you provided these sprinkles, if you put the micronutrient powder onto food, it increased the risk of diarrhea. Bloody diarrhea specifically, if I remember correctly. So that's an important study because it raises awareness, and of course it was in the newspapers, it received some attention, and then I had to respond on that. And we had to think, so DFID then had to think very carefully about its ongoing programming, because it currently, it supports the provision of sprinkles through UNICEF in multiple countries, including Bangladesh and everything. And so, in fact, what happened was that there was a halt on any new studies until the paper had gone through period, because of course what happens with these major papers is we learn about them long before they're published. So we learned about the sprinkle paper at least 6 months before it was published. The main author came and spoke to us, presented the data, and the decision was within DFID that we should wait until it was published, had gone through peer review, had gone through then the correspondence that often happens on big papers, and then once it had gone to that, then we could make a decision on what we should do. So during that period, before it had gone peer review, the decision was not to have any new programs on sprinkles, because we wanted to know what the international reaction was. And actually, when you think about the role of journals, some of that, really important role of journals is to provide the evidence, and then as Keith said, actually let's have a backwards and forwards, let's have a discussion about that in the press. And that often happens, and that's really, really important. And then once that discussion had been had and there were no major criticisms of sprinkles, then it becomes a debate about the relative benefits of providing sprinkles and the relative costs of providing sprinkles. And a little bit of more diarrhea, is that bad versus improving hemoglobin status in children at the national level? Is that good? How do you weigh it? And then it's a judgment. And that's at a much more senior level than mine, which is quite nice. But I think that's a bit. Of course, I guided that, but thankfully, it's not my decision. But that also then brings up to there's the evidence, there's the understanding of evidence, there's the interpretation of the evidence, but then there's also the timing of that evidence, and that's, as you all know, and any other policymaker in the room, that's really critical. Because you may well have the most important study that's going to change the world, or the most important systematic review that's going to change the world. If it doesn't meet the timing of the political leaders that they want to do that at this time, it's not important. And so actually, that's quite a frustration for me as a scientist sometimes, because I say, look, this is really important evidence, we must change our policy on this, but if the Secretary of State in the UK it's not relevant to what she wants to do at that time, nothing happens. So actually that timing, that opportunity to make a change is a very, it's not clear how that happens or why it happens or when it happens, and the value of evidence in making that happen. And there's a lot in that policy space that's very unclear. But obviously we would hope that a lot of policy is based on evidence, and that's what we're certainly pushing for in DFID.
I think I'd like to raise just a few more questions, and I think we'll bring this session to a close. But for the past 2 days, we've tried to look at research that might inform our understanding of the pathways through which agriculture and other nutrition sensitive interventions might impact on specific nutritional outcomes. We also heard about very large programs taking place almost throughout the country, and we've heard about, in some cases, the need for counterfactuals and the importance of that for being a little bit more sure that a intervention set may or, has an impact on an outcome. So I'm just wondering if we might comment on a couple of things, sort of bringing back the bigger picture of programs that are out here working on WASH, doing agricultural work, doing direct interventions, and then us hearing, Alan, your first discussion and your first talk 2 days ago was, needing to firm up that evidence base, and yet the timing of policymakers, the timing of the global community of donors being ripe and recognizing that these are potential areas, and programs being asked to do that, and funders thinking about ways of funding those efforts. So there's a lot happening, and I don't know if maybe you all wanted to comment on what, from a research perspective and or a program perspective, and when I mean a program, what research within a program perspective in Nepal might be sort of a way to deal with all those factors, and I'll just leave it open at that.
So that's a tough question. I'll just make 2 points. One is for those in our large agriculture to nutrition community who are in the program area and interested in doing research to advance the agenda, recognize the difference between, we talked about it, operations research and efficacy research. A program is operating based on a presumption that it's pursuing a worthwhile goal. You may not be able to change that goal by doing research within your program. And so stay focused on where the strengths of that data is. It gets a little bit to what Dale's comment was. Programs consist of resources, inputs, throughputs, outputs, and there's a great deal of data that can be collected, linking those elements together and learning about how to then carry out programs more efficiently, target groups reached per rupee spent, whether the program is being adequate in terms of its content being delivered, whether its coverage is being achieved according to intention. There's a tremendous amount that can be learned from implementation science that is within your reach. So that's on the program side. For the bioscientists, for the epidemiologists, for the budding trialist, I would say keep your sense of discovery alive. You can be overwhelmed with the questions that are already out there, with the data that are already out there. You need to know about it. You need to be integrating that information all the time. But keep your sense of discovery in view, because that is what is exciting. We do not know it all. We do not have all the answers. We've not asked all the questions. When you think about micronutrients, for example, if you say micronutrients to the policy community, it comes out vitamin A, iron, iodine, and zinc is sort of mentioned. There are about 35 other micronutrients, whether they be amino acids, lipids, other vitamins, other minerals that we don't pay attention to. And so there are lots of ways to be thinking innovatively and to be pursuing a path of discovery in your career. Don't be overwhelmed by the fact that so much has been done before you. I'll stop here. I could go on forever.
Yes. I totally agree with the point about passion, retaining passion for change as well as for knowledge. Both matter. You have to be passionate if you're going to engage for a long term, particularly doctoral level, but anything above high school actually. Engagement in data collection and analysis, and doing it well requires you to be dedicated to doing it well. You have to want to do rigorous research. You have to actually commit to it. But at the same time, I would completely agree, you have to be passionate about what it is that you're really trying to understand. What is the knowledge, not just the facts and the data. What is it that you're trying to change through that knowledge? And always, always keeping that fire burning is one of the keys to good science. The only other thing I would add on to put on the table, since we have been talking agriculture, markets, economics, public health, nutrition, and so on, is that it's not just beginning now, but I think Nepal colleagues here have to make a commitment to reaching out across disciplines themselves, have to, through the various journals, teaching agendas, institutions, there needs to be greater commitment, it's not easy, but commitment to teaching the next generation of scientists to understand the methods of their colleagues in other sectors, to understand the disciplinary tools and methodologies in other disciplines. We can't talk with each other unless we actually take that next step and be able to work as teams, bringing in specialization, yes, sectoral knowledge, but being able to talk the same language of methodology and rigor and evidence is a first and a very, very important step. So that means reaching out to the agriculture, the environment, the WASH, the health people, and trying to get the next generation of young scientists and future professionals to be more holistic in their thinking and focused on problems that need solving, not just disciplinary agendas that have to be pursued. I suspect that innovation going forward is where disciplines butt heads against each other, as opposed to deep inside the individual disciplines alone.
I only have one very quick thing to say. There's a very nice book by a man called P.B. Medawar, who is a chemist. And the book is called Advice to a Young Scientist. And if you open up the front cover, it says this piece of advice, which I think is really important: never fall in love with your hypothesis.
I just would like to, to address student, especially because many of you have been doing prevalency study. We are talking of meta-analysis, systematic review, this and that. Probably you might be disappointed with the work that you have been doing. These are precious work, Well, generally what we call is there is a hard science and soft science. If we are comparing A, B, C of chemical, it's not always possible to do RCT, even in ethical ground, and not that important also. It depends upon your research question. Even prevalence is very, very important. It's not that easy to do prevalency study, especially to find denominator. There are areas, and we need to learn. And not only of this quantitative epidemiological study that has a p-value, CI, and this and that. Even you can do a review of qualitative study. The message is you have to have a pre-specified criteria to be included in method, to be answered, in the results section. What is the question that you really try to find out? Like in method, qualitative study, you want to include FGD, participant observation, or ethnographic note, or exploratory study. You specified, pre-specified, so that your result will be reportable. That's the kind of message actually for the student. You can it depends upon your research question, and RCT is these days is gold standard, and going beyond is systematic review is coming up and up. But prevalence and this and that study, these are equally important. Like DHSC study, what is this? This is a kind of prevalence study. And that's formed the basis to report our health status of this country. We do every 5 years. If we don't have DSS survey, then we don't know the national infant mortality rate. That's equally important to rank our country. It's, you know, it depends upon the question that many of you have been doing this prevalence study or case control study for your master thesis. These are, you know, precious job in your life, and for us also to educate, and don't be disappointed that the eminent scientists have been talking of very high up. Probably we might not have a chance to participate in a randomized control trial. RCT is not that easy to, you know, find resource, to design, to question, you know, these are extremely important. But we need to note this because people are reporting and we are depending upon, especially for hard science for selection. I just would like to encourage you not to be disheartened with the RCTs and longitudinal study and this and that. With this, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Barlow. I think that's a good concluding remark to end this session with, and that is just to make sure the methods fit the question, be true to the methods, be strict with them, be rigorous with them. So I would like to thank our three speakers this morning. Let's all have a round of applause for them. The next item on the agenda is the distribution of the Global Development and Environment's Social Science Library packets, and I'll call on Patrick to...
Okay, before everyone leaves, this is in the spirit of sharing and capacity building. We just wanted to take advantage of this gathering to share a packet of knowledge, let's say, knowledge resources, to the representatives of individual institutions here in Nepal. Let me just explain. This packet is in a sense, it's called the Social Science Library Digital Database. It was created at Tufts University by the Global Development and Environment Institute. And the goal is precisely to assist scholars and thinkers, policymakers, and students in developing countries, and I quote, to contribute to and benefit from the ongoing creation of knowledge and understanding. And these are packets that include multiple CDs, which include 3,500 or so full articles and more than 10,000 full bibliographic references and abstracts across 7 different disciplines, which are economics, anthropology, history, philosophy, political science, psychology, and sociology. Other disciplines are going to be added to those, but these are the 7 in the social sciences. And these databases are distributed on CD-ROM and on a thumb drive available here. And the whole purpose here is to have these at institutions. There's a poster, there are flyers where each department can be made aware of these. These can be held within a library of an institution so that even if you have poor internet access, you can actually have access to current, important, impactful, actually well done and quite rigorous publications and bibliographies to help you in your own studies and research. So we're just going to call up a representative from these institutions and hand over these individual packets.